My name, again, is Trevor Timm. I'm Executive Director of Freedom of the Press Foundation, and really excited and looking forward to this panel, which is going to be talking about WikiLeaks and the over decade-long case against Julian Assange for publishing U.S. government secrets. We have a great panel with us today. I'm going to actually introduce them as they talk so that we can get into things a bit quicker. But I just kind of wanted to set the stage before we jump in because I'm sure a lot of people in the crowd are very intimately knowledgeable about this case, but there's probably others either here or watching online who may not know about the facts of the case. And I think the facts of the case are incredibly important because we have to remember this case started basically 15 years ago. And so there are people who are 30 years old that when these events happened, they were in middle school or high school. And So, at least in the U.S., Julian Assange is actually more notorious now for his publications of the DNC leaks during the 2016 election. But I think the most important thing to point out was that this case had nothing to do with the DNC leaks or anything involving 2016 at all. It all started back in 2009 and 2010 when Julian Assange received the Afghanistan war logs, the Iraq war logs, State Department cables, and other U.S. documents from whistleblower Chelsea Manning. And while there was always the specter of prosecution around this case, the charges that were brought against him, 17 of the 18 charges were under the aforementioned Espionage Act, which we're going to get into a little bit later. And for all of those charges, it was purely related to his conversations with a source, potentially asking for more information, receiving documents, and then publishing some of those documents. Of course, in other words, what journalists do pretty much every day. So the charges were brought in 2018 under the Trump administration, despite the fact that the Obama administration looked at charging Julian Assange under the Espionage Act, but concluded they could not without running afoul of the First Amendment. That obviously did not stop Donald Trump, but it also didn't stop the Biden administration from continuing the case, which we're going to talk about the conclusion of this case and the aftermath a little bit later. But so first, I want to introduce Rebecca Vincent from Reporters Without Borders. Rebecca is one of the most amazing campaigners for press freedom that I know and has worked tirelessly on this case for many years, including attending virtually all of the hearings over the extradition right here in London in person for many years. So, Rebecca, I want to start by asking you, Reporters Without Borders is one of the most respected press freedom organizations in the world, and obviously works on cases in many different countries. Why was it so important for Reporters Without Borders to speak out so vocally on this case, especially when, at least in some circles, I'm sure it was considered unpopular?
Thanks, Trevor, and thank you so much for your kind words about our campaigning. And just to take a moment before we go into the ins and outs, campaigning works. That is the only reason we've had a positive outcome in the case this year is due to the tireless efforts of others on the stage, many in the room, others around the world, and I mean campaigners, journalists, lawyers, everybody involved in different aspects of this. So we should be heartened because this was not an easy case. We defended Julian Assange precisely because of his contributions to journalism and the dangerous implications his case had for journalism around the world and for global press freedom. So although the means of his release were imperfect, I think pragmatically, it's probably the only solution that was possible in this political climate. It is still a victory for journalism and for press freedom, let me say that. But despite the fact that that was, not perhaps the ideal solution that some would hope for, it allowed for his release. But the way that he was targeted for nearly 14 years in and of itself had already a distinct chilling effect on, in particular, national security reporting around the world. So It would have been even more dangerous had this continued, had he been extradited to the US, had he been put on trial there. But it was the chilling effect, it was the signal that it sent to others around the world, and it was the precedent that could be set by the Espionage Act. And we should talk about that too, because that remains a threat to journalists, not only in the United States, but globally. So we defended Julian to defend journalism, to defend press freedom, to defend everybody's right to know around the world. And frankly, it was the most complicated case I have ever worked on in the most complicated campaign, but it's often those cases that are worth defending the most. And to hold our democracies to account is also extremely important. When we're working on these issues around the world, including in many authoritarian countries, to hold our democratic governments to the same standards is incredibly important.
Absolutely. So, you know, as I mentioned, you were in the hearings pretty much the entire time. And again, for people who don't know, there was a years-long extradition battle where Julian Assange was in Belmarsh prison here in the UK. You visited him several times at the prison as well. You know, I'm curious from your perspective as somebody who went to these hearings, what did you think of the media coverage of those hearings, or maybe the lack thereof? And, you know, can you explain why you think that there was sometimes a lack of support for protecting Julian Assange's press freedom rights?
Good question, Trevor. I think first I'd like to just take on the facts around the hearings themselves, because something that might not have been obvious is how difficult it was to gain access to these proceedings. So I'm not a journalist. I'm an NGO observer when I go to trials like this. And I say this court, it was several courts, in fact, over a number of years in London. They did not want us there. We had to battle to get in. And I have never had that experience on any other case in any country context, including countries much further down our World Press Freedom Index than the UK. So that already sends a signal about the approach of UK authorities. You mentioned the prison visits as well. We had to fight quite a battle to gain access to him there too. Every time we came up against any sort of part of the British state here, it was very difficult to do our job. So although this was a US case, there was these issues here in the UK too. Getting into the hearings and monitoring them as I did, there were often journalists in attendance. This went on during the pandemic as well, so there were various restrictions at different phases. Actually, in some regards, that helped ensure more media access when remote access was provided to those outside of the country. In the appellate stages, that access was revoked to international journalists. You had to then be physically present in the UK even to access the remote hearings. But there were journalists who stuck with it, who reported diligently. The coverage was not always, towards the beginning, clear on the fact that this is about journalism, it is about press freedom. I felt around 2020, when the extradition proceedings started, that was a moment when a lot of the free expression community had taken a step back from supporting Julian for various reasons. We tried to cut through that in our campaigning, and part of that was bearing witness to the proceedings itself and talking about it, using our platform to make sure journalists and the public were informed on what was happening. But it was really important to correct a number of, misconceptions. This is really important. There was a lot of misinformation and kind of misunderstandings, shall we say, about aspects of the case that resulted in many not supporting him as vigorously as maybe they would have if they were just considering the principles. So that was challenging as a campaigner. Almost everybody already, after all these years, had formed an opinion about Julian himself, about what this case was about long ago. But to correct things that people believed that sometimes weren't true or that were taken out of context, the US government worked really hard to make the case look like it was about things that it wasn't. So correcting all of that was extremely important. And the media, over time, I think you could see at points when there were small victories in the legal case, when the reporting then sort of better identified what was at stake for global journalism. And towards the end, I think there was really vigorous support for him around the world, from anybody working in the free expression space, from journalists around the world, and then from governments such as Australia, which I think were game-changing. But I don't think it's a coincidence that when everybody came together, when there was more solidarity, allowed eventually for a solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, speaking of misconceptions, we talked at the last panel a lot about the First Amendment. And, I think a lot of people, both around the world and frankly in the US, don't quite understand that actually for decades and decades, journalists in the United States at papers like the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal regularly publish documents and stories that the government considers classified. There's a rather famous case around this involving the late whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers involving Richard Nixon in the Vietnam War in the early 70s. And for more than 50 years, it's essentially been established that journalists have this right, as does anybody reporting on the news. But you mentioned in your introduction also about the threat that international journalists face. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, why not just journalists in the U.S. should have been worried about this case, but international journalists as well.
Sure. Well, first of all, the fact that Julian Assange was targeted in this way, he was not a U.S. citizen. He had no ties to the U.S. He was not a resident. He was an Australian citizen working in London at the time that this case started. The fact that the Espionage Act could be considered to apply to any journalist in any part of the world is very disturbing. And even more concerning is where things were going in the UK courts. In fact, we were waiting for an appellate hearing at the time that then the plea bargain was reached and he was released. But what the High Court was looking into at this stage was questions over, for example, whether the First Amendment would be extended to Julian Assange if he were brought to the US for trial. And we know that it probably wouldn't have been. So not only is the Espionage Act itself still a danger, it could be used against any journalist anywhere in the world that reports things that, frankly, embarrass the United States. We know also that they're unlikely to be given First Amendment protections if they're brought there. So this should be of concern to governments around the world, and media organizations around the world should be aware, too, of the risks that their journalists face. So that chilling effect is kind of still there. And that act, and I think we'll probably go more towards solutions a little later, but that the Espionage Act remains in dire need of reform at a minimum to include a public interest defense.
Absolutely. So we're also lucky to have Holger Stark here, who's the Deputy Editor-in-Chief of Die Zeit, and also worked actually directly on the State Department cable's release with the international partnership of news organizations and directly with Julian Assange in 2010. So Holger, just to start off, I would love to just hear more about what that experience was like, both working directly with WikiLeaks at the time, but also the climate that surrounded these stories, because I think people forget, this was global front page news for months and months and months.
Yes, exactly. Thanks for having me, Trevor. It was a fascinating time, 2010, and I spent a lot of that year here in London, partly together with our team at Der Spiegel at that time, working with WikiLeaks, but also working with the colleagues from Guardian, New York Times. They had kind of like a delegation here. And we started going through the files, first the Afghan war logs, then the Iraq war logs in October, and finally the State Department cables in November. And it was an up and down, like a roller coaster emotionally, because the material was so rich, it was so fascinating to dig into that kind of documents. Remember, it was 750,000, something around that documents. We never had such a huge amount of such a trove of documents. It was also one of the first cases of the modern era of leaking digital data. In the old times, Daniel Ellsberg was at a copy at the Pentagon and tried to copy the Pentagon papers physically. Now we had this huge cache, and the question was how to dig into it. And every time someone from the group found something exciting, it was like, wow, did you see that cable? Oh, wow, what kind of report from Afghanistan is that? And so we had like adrenaline flashes all over the place. And at the same time, it was already some kind of like rocky road, because we realized that WikiLeaks' approach and Julian's approach was way different from the, I would say, traditional approach. So we argued back and forth a lot about the question, should all material be on the market? Should we publish names? Should we redact certain personal information, personal data? And it was just a different cultural and political approach at the time. There was one moment when two of the media partners were almost ready to publish without WikiLeaks, because it was such a tension in the debate, in the run-up, especially for the cables. And we invested a lot to pull back the coalition and say, like, well, we started this together, let's do this together. And then we came out, as you say, Trevor, especially in late November 2010 with the cables, and it went like a wildfire around the globe. And it was something entirely new. The dimension was new. The political impact was unprecedented, I would say. And also this kind of collaboration between 5 media partners and WikiLeaks.
Yeah, it was really kind of the first partnership of its time. You know, we've seen several similar partnerships since, but it was kind of really pioneered.
Yeah, kind of the mother of this kind of collaborations, yes.
So the group of publishers that initially partnered with WikiLeaks, so I believe it was the New York Times, Guardian, Der Spiegel, El País, and Le Monde. And so later on, when the prosecution happened, actually, I was a defense witness at one of the extradition hearings talking about the press freedom implications. The prosecutors were constantly going back to the fact that some of the news organizations that initially worked with WikiLeaks had criticized Julian Assange for various reasons. And essentially the prosecutor's implication was, oh, well, these news organizations don't care about Julian Assange, right? So how does this affect press freedom in general? But around the same time, you were actually involved again in organizing these 5 key news organizations to push back against essentially what the prosecutors were arguing. And this culminated in a letter that all 5 news organizations signed. And as somebody who has organized many letters, I can't even imagine how hard it was to get 5 global news organizations to agree on the same language. But I was hoping you could walk us through that process, and how difficult was it?
It was incredibly difficult, and it took me several weeks to start that project. I found it from the beginning disgraceful that the publishers were very much open-minded when the material was on the table, and immediately joined the group in publishing that, and distanced themselves after Julian was arrested and then also indicted and prosecuted. I think it's not very courageous to take material and to benefit, to win awards, to have prestigious conference talks, and when it gets a bit tougher, then to distance yourself and say, like, well, this is the one guy, and we don't have to do with him. And basically, that was a kind of approach that many journalists in general undertook, and also these 5 news organizations. So I left Spiegel in 2017 and joined Die Zeit. So for me, it was from the beginning kind of like a weird situation, because I wasn't involved any longer. So I approached those 5 editors-in-chief without having any kind of mandate. That made it even more complicated. Some of them were very fast in agreeing and said, like, yeah, that's a good point, we sign. So I drafted the first letter, which called for the immediate release and drop of the charges against Julian. So I had like 3, and then pretty soon 4 out of those 5 together. I'm not saying who was not part of that group, but it wasn't this side of the Atlantic. So I dealt with that remaining member of the group, and it was like drafting a 2+4 diplomatic solution, ending the Ukraine war or something like that. Every half sentence was really at stake, and it was clear that parts of the indictment concerned that 5th partner so much that they wouldn't call for an like unanimous release, immediate release, unconditional release, and the drop of all charges, because they were concerned that computer intrusion, which was one of the 17 or 18 points in the indictment, is not something that journalists should do. So whatever was related to those computer intrusion charges should be excluded from that public letter. And therefore, they couldn't make the case for an immediate drop of the charges. Also, they said, well, maybe some parts of the other charges, who knows? So at the end, we found a diplomatic solution. I think there's a language in it which is not entirely clear, so it left some leeway for the fifth partner, which led to Stella Assange's criticism. I called her and said, like, well, I finally reached something. And Stella said, like, well, are you calling for his release? And I said, yes, kind of, not immediately, but and so Stella was, of course, deeply disappointed and said, how dare you? How can you? So for me, it felt a little bit like between a rock and a hard place. At the end, Stella accepted it, the language, because it was clear it wouldn't go anywhere if we would call for the 100% solution. So finally, we published it, and it made some waves. Got also some good coverage in the United States from other media parts, where it has been distributed. And I think it maybe, as Rebecca said, like contributed a little bit to the campaigning. It was late. I would say it was too late. It wasn't very courageous, but it was.
Yeah, I think it still, despite all those points, I think it was one of the turning points in the case, because up until then, back in the United States, like, we were pulling our hair out because we were like, how are journalists and news organizations essentially ignoring this case, given that when you read the indictment, it is word for word what journalists are doing every day. And so, there's always kind of this, whether it's jealousy or personal differences. With Julian Assange, there was always this feeling, well, he's not part of the club. So I was hoping you could speak to that unfortunate lack of solidarity, at least in the beginning, and how it potentially had made the case draw out and, ultimately, at least a little bit, backfire on the journalists who refused to speak out.
Yes, I agree. I think it contributed. It made it much easier for the U.S. government to proceed with the case. I think it has to do with two main points. The first is that Julian always criticized what he says mainstream media. I don't like that term too much. I would more say like traditional media. He, in the early days of WikiLeaks, said something along the lines of, I believe that most media must be destroyed and then it must be, before it can be rebuilt from scratch. So his approach always was that the media industry is rotten. And to some aspects, that is definitely true. But if you have someone who comes from an alternative medium and says like, well, the entire industry must be destroyed, you don't have too many friends in that industry. So that's point one. And point two is, as I mentioned before, there were those cultural differences. I am dealing with national security documents since 25 years. I also worked with the Snowden material, the NSA files. And you almost always come to a certain point where you have to make a call whether you want to publish everything unredacted or you want to leave some things out. And in a lot of those documents, you have like names of informants. You have people who are not really part of the story but pop up in the documents. And you often make the decision to redact those names, to protect those people because their name, their biography is not in the public interest and there's a legitimate reason not to be published. So traditional media usually have this approach of as a filter institution and to leave some stuff out. And Julian's approach and WikiLeaks' approach was more like the radical one. We get it in, the source decided it must get out, so get it out. So we had big arguments with each other. I remember that we were standing here in London in the middle of a street and shouting at each other. He said, like, "Wow, that's treason if you call publicly not to release that material." And I said, "Well, my editor-in-chief decided to do so." So we argued back and forth, and that made it also kind of hard to always be on the same side and have common ground. Despite that, I think it's, as I said, it's a disgrace. We should have defended him no matter what, consequentially and without any kind of hesitation. This was a direct threat against journalists and against the journalistic freedom of speech, and every journalist should stand up, should have stood up and defend him.
Yeah, the way that we always phrased it was, nobody's saying don't criticize Julian Assange and his publication choices or any ethical disagreements. There is a huge gulf between criticizing somebody or not liking somebody and a legal criminal case against somebody that could affect everybody else's rights.
Trevor, could I know you need to go to MC, but just on that point, I asked Julian about it in prison one time, and it's really worth noting he chose to work in a partnership with professional media organizations. He didn't have to. He said that to me. He's like, I didn't have to. It's like, I know. And all that entailed, including these heated arguments and what came out of it. So that was one of the most common misconceptions, is that like this unredacted info was just kind of intentionally put out there. And that was never the intent. He intentionally made it harder for himself to go through these processes in the interest of journalistic integrity. So that's really worth bearing in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So MC McGrath, who is a longtime transparency advocate and also a legal researcher on the Assange legal team. This case dragged on, as I mentioned, for several years. And earlier this year, there was a somewhat, I think, at least for the public, surprising plea deal where the administration dropped all but one charge, one of the Espionage Act charges, which they essentially forced Julian to agree to plead guilty to win his release. And so MC, there was for 10 years we've been talking about the indictment and the legal case against Julian Assange, but I think there is even less known about what was actually in the plea agreement and how that related to the indictment. So I was hoping you could shed some light on that.
Yeah. So I think Rebecca made a very good comment earlier about how the US government has tried very hard to make the case seem like it's about something that it's not. And I think that very much comes through when you compare the plea agreement to the indictment. But it also comes through if you compare the conduct in the indictment to what's actually charged. Because Julian faced 18 counts, 17 for espionage and 1 conspiracy to commit computer intrusion count, 175 years total. Of these counts, only 3 related to publication. That's only about 17% of the total sentencing exposure. So while a lot of the focus of the media and press freedom groups has been on the threat to press freedom from publication or mentioning some of the issues with names that Holger referenced, this is actually a very small part of the case. The vast majority of the case, 13 of the 17 counts, of the 18 counts, solely relate to seeking to obtain information from a source. So the real thing at issue in this case is news gathering, and this comes through very much in the plea agreement. I would like to talk about the plea, but I think maybe I should actually first respond to some of what Holger said, because it's a bit more timely, and this also gets into parts of the plea. So the focus of the plea is news gathering, and I'd like to speak about that because I think it's the main risk that the US government's approach to the Espionage Act poses to journalism. But there's something that I think is not very well known about the plea because there is a little bit about publication and redaction. So with just some background on the publication redaction. So all the 3 main publications were redacted. The letter that Trevor was referring to and that Holger was trying to undo some of the damage that it caused is one that was written by the 5 initial media partners that worked with WikiLeaks. So WikiLeaks had about 100 media partners that worked on the diplomatic cables, but just these 5 wrote this letter in September 2011. And the reason why they wrote this letter is that the full set of cables had become available online. This was not something that WikiLeaks had intended or brought about. It was something that happened through third parties, and they were posted on multiple third-party websites, including the US-based website Cryptome, before WikiLeaks republished the documents. WikiLeaks republished the documents only after they were widely available. And one thing that I think is not very it hasn't really been noticed about the plea agreement is that there were 251,287 cables in total. But if you look at the part of the plea agreement that deals with the publication of these documents, it talks about over 100,000 cables. Why? The reason for this is that it does not include the full unredacted release of the cables in September 2011. This is intended to include two sets of documents. One are a set of unclassified cables that were released in August 2011, which by nature of being unclassified shouldn't include information that needs special protection. The other is a set of are the cables that have been gradually released up until that point. So the cables were published. I think I need to explain a little bit about the publication of the process of the cables for this to make sense. So the second set of cables were those that the media partners had chosen to release, basically. So WikiLeaks did not choose which cables to publish. It worked with a coalition of nearly 100 media partners from all over the world who chose which cables related to their stories and published those cables simultaneously with the stories. The media partners also chose how to redact the documents, and WikiLeaks published the redacted documents with the redactions from the media partners. And this makes sense because they had media partners all over the world and they were better suited to understand their local context and what should be redacted in those contexts. So the cables were redacted by the media partners, and the documents that are referenced in the plea, the classified cables that are referenced in the plea, are the ones that were published by the media partners, redacted by the media partners. But these are still said to contain identifying information. Now, why is that? Why would media partners leave identifying information in a cable when they publish it? And this is because sometimes it's necessary. Because sometimes it's relevant to the story. Because sometimes it's a crucial part of the public democratic debate and accountability. Sometimes these names identifying information is. I'd like to give an example of this. So this is a story that Der Spiegel published in 2010. It was co-authored by Holger. It relates to an informant in Germany's FDP party who had been giving information about confidential coalition discussions to the State Department. As a result of the publication of this story in the cable, this person was later identified. It turns out he was the chief of staff to a German cabinet member. A later story reported that he had been relieved of his current duties but not fired. So I give this example because I think it puts things into perspective, because there are many examples like this case. I think it's very easy to overstate the risks when you talk about names or informants or identifying information, but there are many cases where the media partners assessed these risks and found them to be reasonable and still chose to publish identifying information because it related to the story. So if someone has, for example, breached official legal or ethical obligations of confidentiality, is it reasonable for them to be disciplined at work? Is it reasonable for them to be fired or criticized? And should journalists withhold identifying information when these are the only realistic risks? Or could it also be important that the public knows about situations where government officials have passed confidential information to a foreign state, and for those officials to be held to account? Now, the risk assessments that journalists make on these questions do not always line up with the risk assessments that the US government makes on these issues. And this is why the plea agreement talks about how there were classified cables with identifying information. Those are the cables that the media partners chose to publish because they decided that the identifying information should be in those cables because it was relevant to their stories.
So, one of the things at Freedom of the Press Foundation that we were most worried about was the precedent, the legal precedent that this case could set. You could, never in modern history in the United States has a publisher of truthful information, been prosecuted under the Espionage Act. We talked a little bit about the Espionage Act at the last panel and how it has been used increasingly against sources who sign employment agreements with the U.S. government, which can be bad enough, especially when they're exposing corruption or wrongdoing or illegality. But never has it been used against a publisher. That was always kind of the crossing the Rubicon moment for the First Amendment. And so with this plea agreement, we did avoid the worst case scenario. A plea agreement does not count as official judicial precedent that judges are obligated to follow in the future. But MC, curious from your perspective, what is the practical precedent of this plea agreement, and how will this plea agreement potentially affect press freedom rights in the future?
Yeah, so the plea, as I said, it focuses heavily on news gathering, and I think it's maybe helpful to give examples of some of the news gathering activities that form the basis of the statement of facts in the plea agreement. So one of these is conversations with sources. The plea agreement cites how Julian and Manning communicated with each other during the same time period when Manning was sending classified documents to WikiLeaks, and it references comments made in these chats of examples of how Julian encouraged Manning to send classified documents in violation of the Espionage Act. But if you actually look at these comments, they're the sort of ordinary journalist-source interactions that you would expect. So, for example, Manning offered to send Julian the Guantanamo files, a collection of documents about Guantanamo detainees, and Manning asked how valuable these documents would be. The two of them then went on to discuss the specific public interest in the publication of these documents and whether they would be newsworthy enough to publish. And the chat logs are full of examples like this. There's even very generic general statements of encouragement of a source, for example, saying curious eyes never run dry, that are cited as an example of how Julian violated the Espionage Act by encouraging Manning to provide classified information. Another example of news gathering activity that's covered in the plea agreement is public requests for newsworthy information. So the plea deals with both general requests for documents as well as requests for specific documents. So, for example, it says one of the things in the statement of facts is the defendant's website, WikiLeaks, stated WikiLeaks accepts classified, censored, or otherwise restricted material of political, diplomatic, or ethical significance. So, material of political, diplomatic, or ethical significance, that is information of interest to the public, which is not already known to the public because it is restricted in some way. In other words, newsworthy information. So this is not unlike the wording on many tip pages of news websites. In relation to specific documents, the plea focuses on the WikiLeaks wiki on a page called Draft the Most Wanted Leaks of 2009. So this is it's a wiki, so like Wikipedia, anyone could edit it. And this page described itself as a list of the concealed documents or recordings most sought after by a country's journalists, activists, historians, lawyers, police, or human rights investigators. So this was a collaboratively compiled list which aimed to determine which documents are most valuable to the public. And it included documents not just from the US, but from 33 different countries, as well as international organizations. The plea mentioned some of the US documents in the list as this is what the US objects to. So, for example, operating and interrogation procedures at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, CIA detainee interrogation videos, Iraq and Afghanistan rules of engagement. Now, remember, this is 2009, so all of these were related to topics that were being actively debated in the news at the time. So it's very common for journalists to publicly request documents related to timely topics that are the subject of public debate. If you search social media, you'll find numerous requests from journalists for specific documents, including those which might be classified or constitute national defense information. I think Trevor has tweeted some similar, some things asking for the CIA torture report and other things of that nature before.
Holger, you want to jump in?
Yes, please. I agree with everything that Rebecca said earlier, except one sentence. and that is that this was a victory for press freedom, because I see exactly that precedent that you mentioned, Trevor. I think it was a win for and a victory for Julian, long overdue that he was released. I'm really glad for him personally, but I see this as a loss for the freedom of press, because what we have standing here, what's written on paper now, is a deal where a publisher who did what publishers should do, obtaining information, going through it, and then publishing it, had acknowledged some guilt and was treated like a spy. And that's basically what it is. Instead of being a journalist and a publisher, Julian is, with that deal, seeing publicly as a spy. And that is, I think, devastating for the idea and the mission of freedom of press. So I can't see this as a victory.
Very well said.
Can I respond to that?
Sure.
I don't disagree with you, but I still think on balance, two things make me still say that it's a victory. One is if he had been sentenced formally under the Espionage Act, there would be a, and I know some people hope that he would have been acquitted. We don't know what would have happened, but it could have set a very dangerous precedent that then would be actual judicial precedent in further cases. Also, it's really worth bearing in mind his state of physical and mental health. We feared he would not survive a situation of extradition, and Julian Assange being dead in a supermax prison in the United States would certainly have been a terrible blow for global press freedom and for journalism. So that's not only about his own well-being, that's about the even more devastating, chilling effect I think that would have been set. So
No disagreement.
Yeah.
So we have to be out of the room at the stroke of 5. So I want to open this up to audience questions, because I know we're going to have a lot. And please do keep your question very short so we can get to as many as we can.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. All right, folks, if you see me standing by you, I'm gently cueing you to please wrap up so we can get to as many people as possible.
MC, what are the implications for us, those of us that we sign up as media partners across the world, and what we can do to fight or to contribute to the fight for this?
It's hard to give a general answer for that. I mean, the media partners of WikiLeaks in general. If the case were still going on, I would say to be speaking up in support of him. Now that it is over, it's a bit trickier to say what can be done. I think that there are a number of things that need to be done to limit the extraterritorial reach of U.S. extradition requests. I'm not sure this is necessarily a task for the media partners, which is why I hesitate to say it in particular, but it's maybe something to think about. There's, for example, if there had been an effective espionage as a classical political offense, and here we have someone who the Council of Europe has declared to be a political prisoner who's accused of a political offense. And if there were an effective political offense exception, it's possible that that might have blocked extradition. But the political offense exception in the UK is not effective. The courts say that they can't enforce it. The Home Secretary refuses to enforce it because it's not in the Extradition Act. So this is something that will have to happen on a country-by-country basis. But ensuring that there's not a way that that a foreign country can extradite people for espionage, for national security journalism, by saying national security journalism is a political, if you're prosecuting it, it's a political offense, we won't extradite for that. That needs to be legalized in an increasing number of countries.
Other questions?
Thank you. I wanted to ask how important you thought the location of Assange was at the start of this case in terms of being based out of the UK rather than perhaps being in Madrid or Berlin or Paris. How much do you think it was important that it was a UK situation and the relationship that we have with the US and the extradition laws that were in place in that time, and whether it would have played out differently if he had been based in a different territory?
Well, it's hard to know because I think it will differ from territory to territory. But I think that the political aspect certainly would be different in different situations. The legal aspect would also be somewhat different. There would still be ECHR in Madrid or Paris as an option. But they would also have different extradition regulations. I am don't think that the EU treaty with the US has a political offense exception either, so I'm not sure that that would have worked. In the UK, there was actually one very helpful thing that did exist that may have blocked extradition. So the US was backed into a corner at the end of the case because the UK extradition law says that if you might be prejudiced at trial on the basis of your nationality, that you can't be extradited. And now the US prosecutors had said that the First Amendment doesn't apply to foreigners, which is a very disturbing prospect, that the Espionage Act can apply to a foreign journalist, but the First Amendment does not, and it is not a defense. So the UK court said, well, this is discrimination based on nationality. So that is actually a helpful provision in the UK. I think the political situation may have well been better in other countries, but that is something I think is...
Could I add to that? Because I think that the UK government should not be let off the hook for its role in all of this. I think it could have gone very different in the early stages if there had been a more courageous government willing to stand up to the US and protect this person instead of opening it up to all of these years of continued persecution. Yeah. So we've addressed the legalities here, but let's remember that this was at each point that the Home Office had a decision to take, a political decision. They, instead of protecting journalism, they chose to allow the US to proceed with this persecution. That was decisions by 2 subsequent Home Secretaries to allow this to then become a matter before the courts. This did not have to go to the UK courts. And so that signal has been sent that this country cannot be viewed as a sanctuary for anybody facing persecution from whether it's the United States, whether it's a country, you know, I don't know, that we more traditionally think of as a bad guy when it comes to press freedom. And just to touch back on the question about what could we do next too, I think there's still serious questions about the UK's role here. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe issued the resolution which MC referenced, which declared Julian Assange to be a political prisoner. One of the recommendations was that the UK conduct an inquiry into his treatment here. The UK government has so far ignored that. I think there was a piece in Declassified that got into that. I think an inquiry is needed. There's a hand up. I think it's from Joseph from WikiLeaks.
Just considering that the one charge on computer intrusion was the sticking point for the one media organization in the US, and also the way that charge was used as rhetoric to hinder support, could you just explain a bit about that one charge?
Yeah. So there were 18 counts in the indictment, and only one of those, which was just a 5-year count, the others were 10-year counts, so it was less than 3% of the total sentencing exposure, was computer intrusion. Now, a very disproportionate amount of the statement of facts in the indictment, not the plea. There's nothing about hacking in the plea. There's nothing about computer intrusion in the plea whatsoever. In the indictment, though, there was a significant portion that was spent on computer intrusion. At first, this was focused on something related to Manning, but then there was a significant amount of conduct that was added in the middle of the extradition proceedings in June 2020. So we went through a lot of this and we were able to find serious factual issues with it. They're far too complicated for me to get into here, but we're very limited in the UK courts as to how you can contest factual issues with the indictment. So when the judges saw this case, they saw hacking, but really, if you looked at the counts, it was news gathering. And so it's not, it looked like it was something that it was not. And if we had been able to strip away those factual inaccuracies, we would have ended up with something a lot more like the statement of facts of the plea, which is predominantly focused on news gathering and things that are very clearly journalistic conduct. So I think it would be nice if there were a way to allow people to challenge inaccurate facts in political cases like this, so that there's a chance to pare it down to show what the case is actually about, because otherwise there's a risk of putting in misleading conduct. It's considered a matter for trial at the extradition stage, and then the person gets extradited for something that they shouldn't have been extradited for.
And frankly, it was a very effective strategy by the Justice Department because, as MC said, it was one charge of 18, and the other 17 charges under the Espionage Act had nothing to do with the computer intrusion charge. Yet, in all of the Justice Department's press releases, they kept saying Julian Assange is a hacker, not a journalist. And what that did was, it meant that anytime we were talking about the case, that was always all the comments that we would receive from people who hated Julian Assange for one reason or another. There's no reason why we should be supporting him because he's a hacker, not a journalist. Yet, when you actually read the indictment, nothing could be further from the truth. And subsequent reporting after the plea agreement actually kind of laid out the fact that the Justice Department they explicitly wanted an Espionage Act conviction. They did not actually care about the hacking charge as much, and they held out, at least according to the Washington Post, for that Espionage Act plea agreement because they explicitly wanted it to apply to publishers.
Just one thing to follow on from that. I think that one thing that's important about the plea is it has to be accurate. If you're pleading guilty to something, you need to say that the facts are accurate. So we were able to strip out a lot of the things that we had factual concerns about. But when you actually pare the case down, what's left? It's news gathering, predominantly news gathering in some publication. It's journalism. And it's very concerning that the US government theory of the Espionage Act is that these things constitute criminal conduct.
Yeah, was there a point in time?
Oh, there you go.
Okay. Was there a point in time when the U.S. government changed the Espionage Act to apply to people who are not American citizens or residing or living in the United States?
The Espionage Act provisions that Julian Assange were charged under don't make a differentiation between citizens or non-citizens. The Espionage Act has a long and sordid history. It was originally drafted during World War I to go after war resistors, and it's written incredibly broadly. So that it essentially says anybody who is unauthorized to have national defense information with the intent to communicate it to another person is guilty under the law. And so that is actually so broad that it means that anybody who is holding a copy of the New York Times, let alone not even a journalist, just somebody who has a copy of the New York Times that has a classified document published in it, technically is violating the Espionage Act. And that's also part of the reason why, while there have been many times where the U.S. government has almost prosecuted journalists at the New York Times, they have had so far not been able to, because they were worried about the act being ruled unconstitutional, because if you read the plain language of it, it is obviously unconstitutional. And so, they saw an unpopular figure in Julian Assange who did not have a lot of support of journalists, and figured that maybe this is the chance. Maybe we can prosecute him and get it through the court system, and then potentially be able to use that against other journalists.
Okay, we have time for one more question, if there's anyone else. Or we're done with questions. Oh, there's one more question right here. Perfect.
Well, it's not so much a question, but I think we're still focusing on what Julian did and what not. And I think what's most important about his story is that this was a man who made a platform where you could get information that you couldn't necessarily get anywhere else. It was very clear, clean information. And this was so unwanted that the governments made up a lie of rape when there wasn't one. I think it's very important to realize that was lied. Then the media jumped on board and expanded this lie. Then there was this hacking lie. There were lies and lies, and the media went along with it. And it's thanks to, I think the turning point is thanks to Stefania Maurizzi, who did a lot of FOIA requests, who did a lot of investigative journalism into the case. And then Nils Meltzer, as the UN rapporteur for torture, picking it up and making a book out of it. And that went round, and it proved that all of the things that were said against Assange were lies and fabrications. So I think for us as journalists, it's very good to recognize what the governments do. They lie, they block your financial accounts, they do lawfare, and the more they do it, the more important information you're giving.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it at that because we have to be out of this room in like 30 seconds. So
can we take 30 seconds to call on President Biden to pardon Assange? He's got 2 months.
Well, thank you so much to everybody for sticking around. Thank you to our panelists, and we will see you tomorrow.
Thanks, everybody.